Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video, and today we're going to be looking at the 2024 presidential election in a matchup that I have yet to do. We have Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff running against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. We're going to get right into it, characterizing these safe states for Senator Ossoff, which would be Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Colorado, Illinois, Maryland, Delaware, District of Columbia, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New York, and Maine's 1st Congressional District. That is all, I believe, for Ossoff. Now, for DeSantis, he'd likely carry Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, the Dakotas, all of Nebraska except for the 2nd District, assuming it's not gerrymandered, which is not likely to be, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, West Virginia, and I think that's it. So, again, there are some of these states that are more debatable. Notice you could arguably have Kansas in the safe category. I'm going to have it as safe because I don't want to talk about it too much because I don't think it's that important for this election. And you could also debate putting, Missouri or Indiana in the likely column. The closest state to being likely, in my opinion, would either be Kansas or Mississippi. So Mississippi, Jon Ossoff, I think, would do a very good job of getting black voters to turn out. This was talked about as a problem for him in the Georgia runoffs. People said, well, can Jon Ossoff get black voters out to vote for him because black voters are a key part of the Democratic coalition in a state like Georgia? And he answered that question, and he could, as he won a runoff that he was never really in a position to win. And he ran a really strong campaign, and I think that he knows how to win elections, and I think that would be a key part of him running, I guess. And so Mississippi, I think he would, maybe bring down to a 13 or 14 point margin for a victory for DeSantis, but still state that he would win no matter what. Now, for our likely Ossoff states, I think he would New Mexico by a pretty solid amount. I usually put New Mexico in the likely column for my videos, mostly because I think that, Republicans have a couple of favorable trends for them going in New Mexico, most notably the oil industry in the South, and there are rural Hispanics down here that are shifting towards the right, and there's no denying that. But at the same time, there are suburban trends in the Albuquerque area that are really keeping the state in Democratic hands for the most part. So I think that New Mexico probably be around a 10-point Ossoff win. It could easily be safe. I'm not saying that it's in play for DeSantis or that it would be in play for DeSantis in this scenario, but in all likelihood, I wouldn't bet on it being more than a 12-point victory for Jon Ossoff. He'd also win Minnesota by a likely margin by a probably similar amount as Biden. He continued that shift that we see in the Minneapolis suburbs, and I think he would do a little better than Biden in rural areas, mostly because he would not be as well known as Joe Biden, and because DeSantis would just, run a little behind Donald Trump in rural areas. This isn't to say that, somehow that Biden was a bad candidate in rural areas. In fact, I think Biden, people don't give him enough credit because it could have been a lot worse for Democrats in rural areas. Just that Trump did he was such an amazing candidate for the rural Republican base that he was able to get them on record numbers and made Biden look like a bad candidate, when in reality, I don't think he was that bad. So I think Minnesota goes for also by probably a similar margin. I think he has potential to do a little worse than Biden with working class voters, but I'm not really sure about that because DeSantis would also do worse than Trump with working class voters. So it really comes down to what you think would happen here, but you can't really deny that Minnesota is a state that's pretty favorable to Democrats, and I think that Ossoff would really not have that tough of a time carrying it. Virginia's another one. So Virginia, I do think that Jon Ossoff would likely carry, and I think he could come close to winning it by a safe margin. Realistically speaking, he'd do well enough in the Fairfax area, the Nova suburbs, of course, because these are areas that are predominantly white that are shifting towards the left. There is also a significant community of black voters in Fairfax County that have been keeping it blue for quite some time. And there are also some favorable trends downstate. In Virginia Beach, Joe Biden was the first Democrat to win Virginia Beach since Lyndon B. Johnson, so I guess they have a lot going for them in Virginia. And I think that Virginia is a state that's likely to stay blue and would go for Jon Ossoff. Now, going over to our last likely state for Ossoff, Maine's 2nd Congressional District, I think he would likely carry this district by 10-11%. Nothing really competitive, but not a safe margin. Now, for DeSantis, he has a lot of likely states. I think he'd win Alaska by a likely margin. Alaska's a state that's kind of just for 2024 and for 2022 likely Republican. 2024, I think DeSantis will do a little better than Trump in some cases in Anchorage and with the oil industry, as he's more establishmentarian and more libertarian than Trump is. But I think he'd do a little worse with Native American voters and with minorities, so kind of a trade-off there. But I think he'd win Alaska by a little more than Trump. I think Trump carried it by 10. He'd win it by 11 or 12, so barely likely. Could be safe. Iowa and Ohio are two other states that I believe that DeSantis would carry. Similar to Trump, he would do, or I guess he'd win by similar margins with kind of a trade-off. He might do a little better with suburban voters than Trump, but at the same time, he would definitely lose some ground with working class voters, even though he's still a pretty good candidate for them overall. I also forgot to mention that John Ossoff would carry Nebraska's 2nd district by a likely margin, but not really too much to talk about there. So yeah, these are two states that I think would stay red in 2024 unless Ossoff really tried to win them, which I don't think he'd need. He doesn't need to win Iowa. He doesn't need to win Ohio, and especially Ohio would be very gerrymandered, so we wouldn't have a ton of Democrats to lift at the congressional level. The only realistic reason that someone like John Ossoff would go to Ohio would be to lift someone like Sherrod Brown, who would be on the ballot at the same time as him in the state, but that's a topic for another time. Now, another likely DeSantis state is the state of South Carolina. He'd carry it by, I think, 10 points. Like I said earlier, Ossoff has shown that he has the ability to do very well with black voters and getting them out to vote, but it's still a state that no matter how well Democrats do with black voters, they still have not been able to win, and it's been overhyped in the past. Those talk about Joe Biden making South Carolina maybe a 7-point Trump state. He lost it by 12. Those talk about Jamie Harrison winning that Senate race. He lost it by 10. So, South Carolina, I think for now, we should not jump on the blue South Carolina bandwagon anytime soon. There is one more state for John Ossoff that I think would be likely. This can be a controversial call here, but I do think that he would carry the state of Florida by a likely margin. And, this is really tough for me. Because, while he did do, while DeSantis did do very well in Florida in 2018, he won an election in a blue wave year, and he has shown that he is popular among Floridians. It's still a state that Trump, people act like Trump won it by 20 points. He only won it by 3. And he did that while doing very well with rural voters and Hispanics. There is evidence, and I'm not suggesting it, but there is evidence that Donald Trump did the best a Republican can do realistically in Florida. So it could be totally overhyping DeSantis here. But at the same time, I just think that Hispanics are shifting to the right. And even though John Ossoff is a brilliant campaigner, and I think he'd do well in the suburbs, it being DeSantis' home state, we could see the suburbs shift to the left and continue to shift to the left nationwide. But Florida, they trend right because they love DeSantis so much, just because he's the governor of their state. So I think, risky call here, but I'll give DeSantis Florida by a likely margin. He'd also win Maine's 2nd district by a likely margin, but I think we should move on to more important states. So, at our lean states, I think that the state of Michigan would be lean for John Ossoff. Michigan's a state that the Republicans, I think they had a fluke win there in 2016. And I don't like to call elections flukes because I think that's dismissive of the results. But if Hillary Clinton had done better by an average of 1.5 votes per precinct, she would have won Michigan. So, not exactly something that I think it should be, counted on to continue. Red Michigan. We also saw Joe Biden having really bad performance with working class voters in Michigan in 2020. He still carried the state by a pretty comfortable margin. 3 points isn't, insane, but he did carry it by over 150,000 votes. Was not particularly close. And for that reason, I do think that Michigan is staying blue for 2024, at least. In the future, we'll have to see, but I think that someone like Ron DeSantis doesn't have the ability with rural voters and working class voters to flip the state back to the Republican Party. He's still a brilliant candidate overall. I still think that he is the ideal candidate for the GOP in 2024, but Trump had a lot go away from him in 2016. He still only carried the state by 0.3%. So it's a tall order for the GOP to win Michigan at the presidential level. I don't think they're going to do that anytime soon, or at least in 2024. Now, another lean Ossoff state I think would be New Hampshire. New Hampshire is interesting because, I'll say this in a lot of videos, and I'll say it again. New Hampshire is weird because it's a super independent state, kind of like Alaska, in that they have, well, not really like Alaska, but New Hampshire has a lot of small towns, and they like to split their tickets, so they're kind of independent. Like, New Hampshire is like Montana or Maine or Alaska, in that their voters are very independent voters, and they vote for one party at the presidential level, which in their case is usually the Democrats, and then go completely the other way at the federal, or at the local level, So, in 2020, Joe Biden won New Hampshire by 7%. At the same time, Chris Sununu won his re-election to the New Hampshire governor's race, or to the New Hampshire gubernatorial mansion, I guess you could say, by 32%. So, New Hampshire is a state that I think at one hand, the Democrats would absolutely be favored here in 2024, but I wouldn't be surprised if, DeSantis came out of nowhere and won it. And there was a point in time in 2020 where I think I had Trump winning New Hampshire just because of how independent the state is now. And in my final prediction, I had Biden winning it, but, New Hampshire is a state that I think Trump could have easily won. He didn't really try to win it. I guess he kind of gave up on it, but I think if DeSantis poured his money into it and really tried to win it, he could. But since it's only 4 electoral votes, I think it would stay with Ossoff. Now, the last lean state for John Ossoff is a very important state, and it's the state of Georgia. It is his home state, and he has a lot going for him here. Georgia's trending blue. It did very well in Atlanta in the runoff. Remember, people forget this, but runoffs are supposed to be very low turnout. In 2008, we had a runoff between, I'll pull it up, Saxby Chambliss and Jim Martin. And this was after a crazy presidential election. In 2008, Barack Obama had won Georgia by, sorry, he had not won Georgia. What am I saying? He had lost Georgia by 5, but he'd done very well nationwide. He'd won Indiana, he'd won Ohio, he'd won Iowa, he had won Nevada, which at the time was considered crazy. He'd won Virginia, won Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, Michigan by safe margins, I think. Or not Wisconsin. He won Pennsylvania, Michigan by safe margins. He did very well in Wisconsin, so he had a great performance, and Democrats had 60 seats in the Senate. That being said, in even the general election in Georgia, it was very close. Jim Martin only lost his race by 3%. He was a pretty popular candidate at the time. And then, in the runoff, it just kind of, the bottom fell out for Democrats, and they lost a runoff. Look at the Atlanta metro, right? We see Gwinnett County, pretty red. We see Cobb County, pretty red. We see, even, I forget the name, Fayette County, pretty red. Newton County, I believe this is Newton County, then Henry County, or I could be mixing these two up. I kind of mix these up sometimes. And the only blue counties were Rockdale, Fulton, and DeKalb. And those are basically the Atlanta metro counties. And the suburbs were pretty red. Miller did all right in some of these rural black areas kind of across the middle of the state. Burke County specifically is kind of the key area that Joe Biden actually lost in 2020. And then over here, he did all right. Over here, he won Savannah. But he still lost this runoff by 15%, It was not a good showing for him. And this came after a blue wave election. And then, for John Ossoff to come win a runoff after a Democrat had narrowly won the White House, had narrowly won the House, and they'd end up narrowly winning the Senate, that is impressive. And I cannot stress how impressive that was. Now, I know people were predicting a Democratic win in Georgia for the runoffs. I had a narrow Ossoff and Warnock win, so I got those races right. But it was still pretty crazy to me. And it dawned on me. I was like, wow, the Democrats are winning a runoff in Georgia. That is like, if you had come up to me a year before and you'd said UEP, you wouldn't call me UEP because I didn't have a channel in January 2020. But if you'd walked up to me and said UEP, the Democrats are going to win a runoff two runoffs in Georgia in January 2021, I would have said you're crazy. And I would have said Trump's going to win Georgia by 7%, and the Democrats would be lucky to come within 5 of winning those Senate races. But lo and behold, they won those races. John Ossoff did a great job of getting out suburban voters to vote for him and black voters. So I think he'd win Georgia by probably 4 or 5. DeSantis, I think, kind of like what DeSantis had in Florida, he'd have that boost in the home state. So I think Georgia would be a state that John Ossoff would overperform Democrats at the down ballot level. Yeah. Now, for our lean states, I think that Texas would go for DeSantis by a lean margin. I'm not a big believer in blue Texas 2024. There's been a lot of talk about, Texas can flip in 2024. And it's mostly because I think that Democrats, they're gaining in the suburbs of Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Austin. And, they don't really have too much room to fall in rural areas, so they can, start gaining there again. But they have performed terribly with Hispanics. And there's no evidence to me that that trend is going to stop. And I think that even if Ossoff can, do a little better than Biden with Hispanics, still not likely to flip Texas. I think it only narrows up by a little bit. So Texas, DeSantis state, by 3 or 4%. Another DeSantis state I think he'd win by a lean margin is the state of Wisconsin. Now, you might be thinking, why would Wisconsin be lean? It should be tilt. And the reason I have Wisconsin as lean, not tilt, is because I'm bullish on DeSantis here. I think that he has the right mix of working class appeal and suburban appeal, because he can do very well in the WOW counties. And I think WOW counties, these are suburban Milwaukee counties that are quite conservative. They're more conservative than most suburbs. And they are the heart of the Republican base in Wisconsin, Most people don't know this. I guess a lot of you probably know this, but most people don't know this. The WOW counties, Mitt Romney did better in the WOW counties than Donald Trump, even though he lost Wisconsin by a lot more than Donald Trump. And Trump won Wisconsin because he did so well with the working class, not because he did that well in the WOW counties. And that's from the GOP's blueprint in Wisconsin. Do well with the working class and you win. But I think DeSantis understands that, he would need to win the WOW counties to win Wisconsin. He need to do better than Trump in the WOW counties because he would not be able to match him with the working class. And I think he could do that, and I think he would also get a good amount of working class voters to come out and vote for him. Plus, overall, Wisconsin is a state that's trending to the right, and I think that The Democrats have a very narrow path to victory. They're going forward. And I just think that, John Ossoff, it's only 10 electoral votes. I think that he would not try to win it as much as Biden tried to in 2020. And I think that he would, kind of pull out and say, we're going to focus on Georgia, we're going to focus on Arizona, focus on Pennsylvania instead. I think DeSantis would carry it by 2 or 3%. So, yeah, that is it for our lean states. Now, these are the tilt states, and the election's going to come out of this. So we're going to give Nevada to John Ossoff. And I think Nevada would be tilt, not lean, because I considered putting it in the lean category. But I think it would be tilt, because John Ossoff just would... I don't see him making major inroads with Hispanics, and I think that DeSantis is the ideal Sunbelt type candidate who'd do very well in the, Clark County suburbs, because Nevada suburbs are different in that, they went for Joe Biden, but that was, I think, because of COVID and because, Nevada's economy really got hurt by the lockdowns in COVID, and, because a lot of casinos were closed out, because, Las Vegas is a tourist city, so I think that really hurt the Democrats, or that really hurt Trump in Las Vegas, and I think that in 2022, if the Democrats lose some seats in Nevada, or lose the Senate race there, or lose the governor's race there, it'll be because they were too harsh on COVID in Vegas and the Vegas suburbs. I think that could be the downfall of Democrats in Nevada in 2022. And 24, I think there could be some lingering effect, but I'm not. It wouldn't be enough to make me say that Nevada would be favored to flip. So I'm going to have it as tilt Democratic, which I think is the safest rating for 2024. Now, DeSantis, I think he'd win Arizona, and it would be very close for sure. But realistically speaking, how does John Ossoff match Joe Biden's performance with suburbanites in the Sun Belt? He can do it in Georgia because it's his home state, but in Nevada, in Arizona, and Florida, and Texas, I don't see it happening. I think DeSantis being the governor of a Sun Belt state, I think he knows how to appeal to these voters, especially since he won a competitive race there in 2018 in a blue wave year, and he's going to win again in 2022. So Arizona, I think, would narrowly flip. Plus, DeSantis would, not make the dumb mistake that Trump made of, criticize or, saying that John McCain was a loser because he was captured, that kind of thing. And that rhetoric, Biden, he had asked with the McCain family, and McCain was very popular in Arizona. So that I think that had Trump not said the stuff he said about John McCain, I think he would have pulled it out in Arizona and said he lost the state. So DeSantis, I think, would carry Arizona by about a point. Now, these next states, actually, I'll make them down to Pennsylvania. So DeSantis, I'll give North Carolina, and I think he won North Carolina by doing well in the suburbs. Although John Ossoff would definitely get the black voters out to vote for him. And, he could, when I say well in the suburbs, it doesn't necessarily mean that DeSantis would win the suburbs or do as well as Mitt Romney. I just think relative to Trump, he'd do a little better in the Sun Belt states. So I think for that reason, North Carolina would stay with the GOP, although very narrowly, I think. Trump won it by 1.3%. DeSantis would probably win it by, maybe 0.5, 0.7, something like that. Now, the last state that we have is Pennsylvania, and I'm going to give it to John Ossoff. It's a very narrow state, and, it said 2020 was a tipping point state in 2020. I think it would be the tipping point state again, in that it would give the election to John Ossoff. Because, look, Ossoff, we don't know enough about him right now. We're still 3 years away from a hypothetical 2024 presidential matchup. But what I do know is that John Ossoff might not be the best candidate for working class voters. He can do great with suburbanites, and he's great with black turnout, but he's not as good with working class voters. And I think that he'd have to rely on the suburbs, either Chester County, Montgomery County, Bucks County, to win the state. And I think he'd do just well enough with suburban voters in the Philly suburbs, just well enough with black voters in Philadelphia to win the state. So this is my current 2024 election prediction if it was John Ossoff versus Ron DeSantis. Purely hypothetical scenario. This is not going to be the case because A, this is unlikely to be the matchup. B, predicting election 3 years away is never a good idea. But you guys want to see this matchup, so that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.